observations and examination.
Sure. It begins by examining the body as is when it is received, and so make note of the clothing that the person is wearing. Generally, in this case, in a homicide protocol, the hands are bagged. Those bags are removed, and at that time we can start obtaining any evidence that may be necessary, whether it be fingernail clippings, sexual assault kit, and then we begin disrobing the body piece by piece. At the same time, we are taking photographs, and then we begin by examining the body prior to cleaning the body, looking for any injuries, any pieces of evidence that may be necessary to turn over to law enforcement.
So, did you initially begin, after you had done your external examination, your initial external examination, to take photos of the victim while she was still clothed?
Yes.
And in those initial observations, did you notice any particular injuries? Did any injuries come to your attention in that initial observation?
Yes, it was clear to see that there were multiple blunt traumatic injuries of the head, as well as bruises on the arms and some bruises on the legs.
Did you then remove the clothing from the victim?
Yes. After
the victim was cleaned, did you then take photographs? Let me withdraw that question. Did there come a time when you took photographs of the victim while she still had hair on her head?
Yes.
And then did there come a time when that hair was shaved from her head?
Yes.
And were additional photographs taken then?
Yes.
Is it standard procedure in an autopsy to shave the hair of a victim?
Only when necessary. We do that in order to better visualize any injuries that may be present that's previously hidden by hair.
Now, after the body had been cleaned and you were continuing to conduct your autopsy, what were your next set of observations regarding the external body?
Well, we begin by writing down everything from hair color to eye color to any scars that may be present. But at the same time, we're also taking note of injuries that we may see. And so that began a documentation of both measuring the injuries, writing them down on our note forms, and taking photos of all of the injuries.
And once the body was completely cleaned and the head shaven, there were additional photographs taken?
Yes.
Was there also an internal examination of the victim that was conducted?
Yes. So an internal examination is standard for an autopsy procedure. After the external examination is done, we proceed by opening up the internal body cavities to examine all of the organ systems.
And did you do that in this case?
I did.
And did you find anything of significance when you looked internally, in addition to what you found externally?
There were no significant disease processes, just evidence of prior surgeries, prior splenectomy or removal of her spleen, prior appendectomy or removal of the appendix, but no other significant disease processes.
Well, I want to start with going back somewhat to your observations on the exterior of Teresa Sievers, and I'm going to hand you what's been marked for identification as States Exhibits number 115A through 115J. These have been previously shown to defense counsel.
Sure.
If you would look through them briefly initially and just let us know what they are.
These are photos that were obtained during the autopsy procedure at our office.
Move to introduce States Exhibits 15A through 115A through 115 J through 115J.
Object. We'll show them admitted.
I want to start by, if you would explain to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury, when you were first looking at the face of the victim, observations you made regarding potential injuries to her facial area.
Sure. I could see just by looking at the face, in particular the nose, the forehead, and the right side of the forehead, that there were several lacerations. Lacerations is a term that we use in the medical examiner community. I know laypersons always think of lacerations as any type of cut, but for us, a laceration is a wound that only occurs from a blunt injury. That is, it is a tearing of the skin. It doesn't occur as a result of cutting the skin with a sharp object. And so generally, if you can imagine, an object that strikes the skin does so, and as it compresses the skin, it stretches the skin beyond its elastic capacity, and the skin will tear. And so I see multiple lacerations here on the scalp. And I can see by looking just underneath those lacerations that most of them actually have an associated defect of the skull, a small depressed skull fracture. And in particular, looking at the nose wound, I can feel that there are what's called a comminuted fracture, or essentially like a jigsaw puzzle. The bone pieces are shattered directly underneath the laceration on the nose.
And you were talking about how the bone is shattered directly under the area of the nose. What would cause a bone to shatter?
Direct impact from a force.
We sometimes hear about primary and secondary injuries. Can you talk about what primary injuries are and what secondary injuries are?
Sure. With regards to the head, primary injury obviously is going to be the injury directly as a result of the impact with an object, whether it be in a car accident or from a blunt object striking the head. If that injury, let's say, it causes damage to the brain, it's not uncommon for there to be swelling. And so that swelling, especially with the brain will swell outwards, but it has nowhere else to go because it's confined within the skull. And so the pressure of that swelling is directed inward, which can cause some compression of blood vessels and lead to a stroke. That would be a part of the secondary injury, but in this case, the decedent died prior to that occurring. In addition, with regards to blunt trauma, you can have primary injury which occurs at the impact site, as well as secondary injury which occurs distant to that impact site. So to give an example, if I can use my hands as a diagram here, if my hands represent the skull, let's say my fingertips are where the impact site is. If I have an object that has, let's say, a larger surface area, maybe a bat or a shovel, and it strikes the skull, on the impact site, the skull will bend inward, but the skull is firm. It can't really deform much. It doesn't have much plasticity, and so that force will be rippled outward, and you'll get a sort of an opposite deformation distal from the impact site where the bone bends outward. Very often that causes a fracture, and that fracture will radiate back towards the impact site. That's the secondary injury. And at that secondary injury, that distal fracture, you may have some tearing of the skin. With an object that has a smaller striking surface, like say a hammer, for instance, when that strikes the skull, all the force is impacted at that one site. And so the force is greater on the impact site. And so very often it causes a fracture directly underneath the actual striking object. And you very often get a depressed skull fracture. And you don't often have distal fractures. And so usually you just see the primary injury. Here, in this case, I have all primary injuries.
Your Honor, if Dr. Coyne might step down and show the jury on State 115A what he's talking about in terms of the injuries and what from that photograph they can see.
Yes, sir. You may step down. I'll ask if you stand in the middle so all the jurors can see. And counsel from the defense, you can approach if you need to as well.
Just the first photo, is that more? Here's the right side of the face. Here is laceration on the nose.
Dr. Coyne, I hate to interrupt, but I think we have jurors on this side who can't see, so if you can...
So you can see here on the nose, there are two lacerations. But really, the curved laceration, a little bit of a space in between, but if you connect the two, you'll see they're very similar to all the other lacerations. Directly underneath this laceration is this bruise and this palpable fracture. It almost feels like multiple pieces of bone fractured in one small confined area. And then you can see here, there are several different curved lacerations just prior to the hairline. One tucked just in the hairline. And directly underneath, you can perhaps see here, there's a little bit of a fracture.
Now, when you were talking about the fractures, Dr. I'm just putting on the microphone over here. The fractures that you saw, was there a time when you were able looking completely under the skin where you could see the skull?
Yes, so after we are done shaving the hair, we're able to examine all of the wounds on the head. And then, of course, if we reflect the skin of the scalp, we can see actually all the injuries much clearer to the bone.
Thank you very much. When you were describing the fractures that you saw underneath, is it anything like when a piece of glass is shattered and goes out, or is it like puzzles cracking? What would it be a good description for what you see as that fracture underneath?
The fracture in the nose would have that kind of appearance. It would look almost like a jigsaw puzzle with multiple fractured shards of bone together in one confined area. Whereas other areas we have what are better known as depressed skull fractures, which would be a small ring, if you will, that's of bone that's been depressed with sort of very fine fractured edges around the margins.
As you continued your autopsy, the hair was shaved from the victim.
Yes.
Looking at States 115B, are there additional observations you were able to make that we can see on 115B?
Yes, you can see more clearly some of the wounds that were underneath the hairline.
And I just want to refer now to 115C. What are we seeing in 115C?
115C, you're seeing the top of the head. It's a picture as if the person was laying on their back and the photo is being taken from in front of the top of the head. And you can see the hair has been completely shaved, and you are able to see all of the wounds on the left and right side of the face, the forehead, as well as the back of the head.
And again, if Dr. Coyne could step down with both States Exhibit 115B and 115C, and one at the time, display for the jury what they're looking at and what they're seeing in those two photos.
Sure.
Please.
May step down, sir, and just wait for questioning once counsel gets position. Thank you.
So again, this is similar to the previous photo, except the head is turned, the camera, down directly above the head, and you can see the hair has been shaved. These wounds you were able to see previously, as well as the nose wound. This one was a little more hidden by the hairline. So now you're able to see additional wounds on the left side of the head, as well as the small portion of another wound, which is better visualized on the other photo. Now this is, of course, looking at the top of the head. Here is the nose. Here is the previous wound that you saw earlier. But you can see here on the right side of the head, there are what look to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lacerations. On the left side of the head, there are 3, and you can see also this one here at the top of the back of the head.
And as you were looking at this, what did you consider to be the cause, and I don't mean the particular instrument, but the cause of the injuries which are viewed on that?
As I mentioned, all these wounds were lacerations, so they were made by a blunt object, striking the head. Force was significant enough to tear the skin and produce fractures on the skull underneath.
So what we can't see in this photo, but what if we were to look underneath at the skull, we would see fractures?
That's correct.
And would we see them for each of those impacts that we're seeing on those photos, or for some of them?
Most of them. And actually on the right side, you'll see fractures of the outer table of the skull, not completely through. When you go on the left side, you'll see a more classic depressed skull fracture that goes through the inner table as well.
Thank you. If you could look at States Exhibit 115D.
Yes.
And what do we see in 115D?
115D is a close-up of the right side of the head, including the right ear. And you see there that there is a contusion or bruise that is also associated with the minor abrasion at the top of the ear. And directly behind it is a small laceration, which is consistent with a blunt impact to the top of the ear.
And then on 115E,
This is a picture of the back of the head now, and you're able to see the additional injuries on the back of the head. There's one large open wound just behind the right ear that allows visualization of the underlying brain and brain matter.
and was that visualization possible because of the injuries that were inflicted on the head?
Yes.
So in other words, that's not something you created while you were doing your autopsy, but was there when the victim arrived.
Yes, that's correct.
And what about, let me just have you look for a moment at states 115F.
Sure. 115F shows the wounds on the top right side of the head, and the picture is being taken with a hammer adjacent to that wound.
So let me go back from the hammer for just one moment. When you talked about the injuries that you see on the back of the head, and we had looked at photo 115C and seen a series of injuries that had occurred around the top of the head. Do you see any of the injuries on, excuse me, on 115E that you see on 115C?
You can see you can see one of the wounds on 115E, and I don't know if you're referring to 115F. Several of those wounds are also visualized in 115C.
Okay, and before we have you step down, let's talk about the hammer for a moment. Mm-hmm. Why were you holding a hammer up to the head and looking at it in terms of a photograph?
This was brought to the autopsy by law enforcement. I was informed at the time that this object was found adjacent to the body on scene, and so it was just comparing the actual tool itself to the wounds to see if the size of the wounds would be consistent with having been made by an object such as this.
And were the size of the wounds consistent with having been made by an object like that?
Yes.
And what type of hammer was that you saw at autopsy?
This is a claw hammer, the traditional claw hammer, the general hammer that most persons have in their garages.
And is the size of that claw hammer what I would call a standard size claw hammer?
Yeah, the size of the claw on both the flat part of the head are pretty consistent with what's considered normal, and the length of the head too as well, for that matter.
If you could step down with the court's permission and bring all the photos from C, D, E, and F at one time.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Now, if you would show the jury what is State's Exhibit 115, it should be D.
Yes.
And explain to them what they're seeing and what you found when you were doing your examination.
So this is the right ear, so that the nose would be about where my hand is right now, where my right hand is right now. And so we're looking at the back of the ear, and you can see this right here, it's bruised, but it's also desiccated or dry from being compressed upon impact by the blunt object with a small laceration right behind it. And then sort of hidden below the ruler is a much larger wound that I alluded to before on the stand.
Was that, before we move on, was that wound that's below that you alluded to on the stand, was that made at the same time as the injury to the ear? Could you tell, or did you reach a conclusion regarding that, or is it a separate wound?
They probably would have all heard. It's a separate wound, but would have heard it, at the same time in succession. Or I can't tell you which came first, but it is a separate wound.
And then the next one, 115E, I believe.
115E now is moving a little further away from the head, and you can see that much larger wound here, irregular lacerations, and additional curvilinear wounds at the back of the head here, here and here, which previously weren't visible on the other photographs.
I'm showing you 115C. Are any of the wounds we're seeing on 115E also visible in 115C?
This wound would be consistent with that one right there.
So other than this wound, these are all separate wounds from what was seen in 115C?
Yes. And this one, the bone underneath has been fractured and pushed inward towards the brain, and there are some brain fragments that are present within that wound as well. And then moving on to the next picture, 115F. This is again looking at those wounds on the front of the right side of the scalp and the hammer that was brought to me at autopsy.
And when you did your comparison, what did you find?
The diameter of the head is approximately similar to the diameter of the wounds range in size from, say, 1.8 to this right here collectively is 4.1, but each individual one's between 2 and 2.5 centimeters, approximately the size of the diameter of the head of the hammer.
And I don't think you had any other pictures with you at this
No, I
point.
do not.
Thank you. If you could resume your seat.
Sure.
Now, photo States Exhibit 115G. What is 115G?
115G again is going back to that large wound at the back of the head, and it's right above that wound, so you can really see the visible brain that is able to be seen through the margins of the wound.
So this is this when you said, is this a close-up or is this pulling away?
It's approximate to the previous photo where we saw the ear with the bruise, but now this is directly above the larger wound, so
And
looking down at it.
When you looked at that wound, what observations were you able to make about that wound?
Well, it was certainly a significant wound. In other words, to me it appeared as if this, looking at the other wounds and the small fractures that were associated with them, the edges of the fractures here looked to me like there were multiple impacts that occurred in this one confined area, which of course caused the fracturing of the bone and the bone to be sort of moved inward towards the brain with laceration or tearing of the underlying brain tissue.
So when you say multiple impacts, what do you mean?
At least 3 impacts to one small area.
So that would be 3 separate blows, is that what, or 3 separate impacts, I guess?
Yes, it is my belief that at least 3 separate impacts in this area.
And are there any other particular injuries for that photo that were of note to you?
Above the large wound is a second smaller wound consistent with the previous ones in the front of the head. And then, of course, there's an additional small laceration just to the right of the large wound, which to me looks like may very well be a secondary injury or a tear from the underlying bone fractures.
Now, did you, while you were doing the autopsy, did you determine at least a number of wounds that were, or trauma or blunt trauma that occurred on this skull?
I reasoned that there was perhaps a minimum of 17 different wounds that came from impact sites.
And how did you come to that number of 17?
That's just by counting all the wounds that we saw here in these photos, in addition to guessing that that one large wound was a composite of 3.
And in making your guess that the one large wound was a composite of 3, was that based on certain observations of that wound?
The size of the wound and looking at the curved edges of the skull made me think that there was a coalescence of 3 depressed skull fractures in one general area.
Your Honor, if the doctor might step down with that one photo to show how he came to the conclusion that there were at least 3.
Yes, ma'am. You may step down, sir. Just wait for counsel.
Again, as I was saying, we're now, the view before was kind of shifted almost at an angle, so now we're directly above this wound. And you can peer directly into the wound, and you can see here this is all brain tissue. And brain tissue that has been somewhat pulverized, not in its normal state. And along the edges, underneath the skin, which is not visible here, are the skull fractures. And the skull fractures look to me as if there were three separate skull fractures together that sort of had been merged due to the trauma.
Now, you are showing this, we are showing the jury this particular exhibit. If we were to, did you take photos of the skull after the skin had been removed?
Yes.
And if we were to look at those photos, are those the fractures you're talking about that we would see?
That's correct.
You may resume your seat. Talk about what we see in State's Exhibit 115K. What is 115K?
115K is looking at the base of the skull. This is after the top of the skull has been removed and the brain has been removed from the skull cavity.
At this time, is this a photo that was taken during the autopsy?
Yes, it was.
Move to introduce State's Exhibit 115K. This had been previously shown to defense counsel.
Any objection?
No objection.
We'll show it admitted.
Now, 115K, was there something that you saw in 115K that you found significant?
Yes, so the injury at the base of the skull, there was what we call a hinge fracture. That is a fracture that courses directly from right to left across the skull base, allowing the front and back of the skull to essentially be opened like a hinge or moved like a hinge would. And this is a devastating injury. I see this very often in traffic accidents where a large force has impacted the head. It's invariably a fatal wound. The force of the wound passes directly through the part of the brain called the brainstem, which is what controls our cardiorespiratory centers and helps maintain our normal ability to breathe. A person such as this probably would have been put immediately into neurogenic shock. And again, even persons that make it to the hospital or trauma center don't do well with this type of injury.
And you were talking about the amount of force to create that wound is something you tend to see in, you talked about traffic accidents
yeah.
of great impact. Is
Yes.
that what you said? Permission for the doctor to step down and show to the jury on State's Exhibit 115K where that fracture, hinge fracture is.
Yes, ma'am. You may step down, sir.
This is, as I was saying, the picture of the skull base. This is the top of the head. This is the orbital ridge. Our eyes would be tucked in here. And as you can see, there's a fracture. And this is the approximate area of that large wound. You can see all these skull fractures, one of which probably caused that small laceration I talked about previously. But a fracture line courses across this here, the petrous ridge, through the area of the brain called the sella turcica. That's where our pituitary gland would sit. Courses just underneath the sphenoid wing, directly across. So the fracture line would course directly from right across to left. And that's essentially what allowed me to move the brain, or excuse me, skull base like this. Our brainstem enters through this hole right here called the foramen magnum. And this brainstem will continue as a spinal cord into the spinal canal. And so the force would have been transmitted right through that region.
And can you just show them again where that I think the injury that you were talking about earlier with the at least three hits,
Sure.
where that is in relation to the picture which they're
right
looking
here.
at right now?
You see all the fracturing of the bone.
Thank you. Did you observe other fractures of the skull or line fractures of the skull when you did your internal examination?
What wasn't shown here on this photo here, there are additional fractures of the posterior half of the base of the skull. two linear fractures that were present on the base of the skull, below the hinge fracture. In addition, on the left side of the skull, there was a depressed skull fracture that went through the whole skull, and then radiating away from that fracture were two small linear fractures. That happened in the area of the skull that is our weakest part of our skull, on the lateral surfaces.
So if using your head, if you could show us with your hand where the fractures you were talking about that you saw that you said were below the hinge fracture.
It's hard to, it's actually, it will be back here, coursing underneath.
And the hinge fracture that you were talking about on your skull, can you just show us kind of where it starts on the
Sure.
skull? Kind of
Approximately started right here, and then in the petrous ridge, the temporal ridge, and it kind of coursed across diagonally and would have ended up about right here.
Now, as you continued your examination, what other injury or trauma did you observe with Teresa Sievers?
In addition, I had mentioned, of course, the lacerations of the brain, and there were hemorrhages, we call them petechial hemorrhages, throughout the right side of the brain that went inward to some of the deeper brain structures, extending into the hindbrain. That, to me, is indicative of significant brain trauma or traumatic axonal injury. It would have been a severe injury to the brain itself. In addition, on her body, she did have bruises that were present on both arms, as well as both knees. There was, I believe, a bruise on the right thigh, in addition to bruises on the abdomen.
Let's talk about the bruises for a moment. If you could look at State's Exhibits H, I, and J.
Sure.
When we look at State's Exhibits 115, H, I, and J,
Just making sure I have all of them here. Hold on 1 second. I have HJ. I believe I just have H and J here.
I think one of them may be stuck.
You may.
Sorry. I have these. There's K. G. F. Okay. Sure. Alrighty.
Looking at H, I, and J, what are these what were you trying to capture in these photos?
They are pictures of the forearms and hand. This will be the left hand, and they show bruises that are present on the arm.
Before we discuss these photos any further, would you describe for the ladies and gentlemen of the jury the bruises that you saw on the victim's arms, forearms, that area,
Sure.
during your autopsy? Because
Sure.
you alluded to them briefly a moment ago. Would you describe for them?
There were a couple of bruises on the back of the left arm and around the left elbow. In addition, there were some bruises on the posterior or back and lateral aspect of the right arm, bruises on the extensor part of the right forearm, as well as the flexor part of the right forearm, and there was a bruise on the back, the medial part of the forearm on the left hand, or left arm, excuse me.
When you observed any of those bruises, did any of them strike you as, well, let me withdraw that question. When you observed those bruises, did you draw any conclusions as to possible causes for some of the bruises on the arms?
Some of the shapes of the bruises looked very similar in terms of the round, semicircular as the wound you saw on the head, so it was my assumption that they were perhaps made by a similar blunt object.
And are you familiar with the term defensive wounds?
Yes.
Do any of these bruises seem to potentially be what might be called a defensive wound?
They could be consistent with that, and I say that because when we refer to defensive wounds, we're also, when a person is being attacked, it's not uncommon for them to raise up their arms to protect their face to try to parry a blow. And so in that setting, a person can get wounds on their forearms, the undersurface of the forearms, and the what I call the extensor surface of the forearm. All of these wounds are in that general area, so it certainly could be consistent with a defensive wound.
And I'd ask that the doctor be permitted to step off the stand and show to the jury those three state's exhibits.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Your Honor. That would be 115 H, I, and J.
This is going to be the flexor aspect, or the under part of the forearm, the right hand. You can see that there are several bruises here, pointing to 4, perhaps 5 bruises. Moving onward, this is now the back of the forearm. You see this bruise here. Moving forward now, this is the left hand turned with the thumb downward, and you can see this bruise directly below the wrist.
Thank you. If two people are hit with the same instrument, with the same force, at the same point in their body, which is probably an impossible hypothetical, but if two people were hit with the same instrument, with the same force, in the very same part of their body, would the manifestation of the injuries be identical?
I would expect not. The reason being is it's dependent upon individual differences as well as the area of the body that is impacted. And our skin is under varying amounts of tension, and that's due to the collagen fibers that course underneath our skin. And actually those lines of tension are called lines of Langer. They were mapped out 100 years ago by a German anatomist, and he had literally made holes in cadavers with an ice pick and looked at the shape of those holes and how they differ based upon where they were created. And surgeons actually use that to try to, when they make an incision for surgery, they try to go parallel to those lines, because when they close that wound, they want to create less of a scar. So a wound under less tension is going to produce a smaller scar. So when a person is hit, for instance, if you look at my head, as the scalp curves around, I have a big nose here, so I'm sure the skin is under tension here as well. When you get hit in an area of curvature where the skin is under more tension, that wound may open up wider, it may tear larger, and so lacerations can look quite different on the same person, depending upon where they're hit, as well as compared to a different person. In addition, as we age, our skin changes, and so the collagen density under our skin, the elasticity of our skin changes. If I pull up the skin of my hand, it drops back down. 20 years from now, that may stay up. We bruise much easier as we get older because of that. And so therefore, a wound on a person's body could be much different if the same person used the same object, used the same force, but hit two different people, even in the same area versus in different areas.
Did you consider performing, well, let me start with this. Are you familiar with the concept or the tool mark analysis?
Yes. Yes.
Did you consider performing a tool mark analysis in this case?
I did not, and I'll explain, if I can explain what a tool mark analysis is. It's more commonly used with us, actually with projectiles or bullets. And so, for instance, let's say a person I do an autopsy was shot and there's a bullet retained in their body. And law enforcement may have arrested a suspect, and that suspect has a gun with ammunition in that gun, believed to be the same ammunition that shot the victim. I will retrieve that bullet and hand that bullet over to law enforcement. Crime scene now will then take that weapon, fire it in a test range, obtain that bullet, and they can compare those bullets under a microscope to look for unique markings imparted upon those bullets by that weapon, the rifling of the weapon. And that will help them figure out if this gun was in fact the one that shot the victim. You could do the same thing with blunt objects, more commonly with sharp objects. And so during my time in Miami, I had a homeless person who was stabbed multiple times in the chest, through the breastbone, through the ribs, and I was able to cut out those portions of the bone and give it to the crime lab, where they were able to make a cast of those portions of the bone, cast the potential weapon, and then compare them under the microscope to see if in fact those weapons were the same. It's a little bit harder to do with blunt objects. A hammer, we all use our hammer differently, but 3 out of 10 hammers may be striking the same nails, may be used in the same way, so it's a little bit harder. But nevertheless, you can still do a cast analysis. But for me in this case, looking at the depressed skull fractures, the margins of the wounds were pretty fragmented. I didn't feel the information present in there was significant enough to ask them if they wanted to do a tool mark analysis, because at the end of the day, I'm a medical examiner. I'm not going to do a tool mark analysis, and my job is to determine cause and manner of death. And so if a person wants to figure out whether or not this weapon may have been the weapon that murdered someone, that's the job of law enforcement. They're going to levy those charges and arrest that person. But I will certainly do it for them. In this case, law enforcement came to my office with a weapon that was found on scene that had both hair and blood on the weapon, and they were able to attain DNA from that weapon. And DNA is far more sensitive and specific than any tool mark analysis. So that's why I didn't do it in this case.
And you spoke about the wound edges being fragmented. How does that impact trying to do an analysis anyway?
It just adds more. So bone, it's not like a clay mold. And so, yes, certainly you can obtain information from a bone. And you hope that with a blunt object, when you're striking it, that imperfections on the surface of that blunt object will be imparted on the bone. It's much more difficult with a blunt object than it is, say, with a sharp object, because a sharp object is going to go through and cut and leave cut marks. In this case, we had multiple fracturing of the depressed fractures. I didn't feel the information there was worthy of me to say, hey, this may be an option for you, because I knew at that point in time they had DNA evidence, and that's far better than that. So.
And when you say DNA evidence, you mean that they had taken DNA swabs, so they had that?
Yes, they had the potential to do DNA evidence, yeah.
And did you, the wounds that you saw on the skull of Teresa Sievers, were they consistent with the type of wound that could be made from the hammer that had been handed you by law enforcement?
Yes, indeed. If you look at forensic pathology textbook pictures of hammer injuries, they're textbook wounds.
Did you determine a cause of death for Teresa Sievers?
Did.
And what was the cause of death for Teresa Sievers?
Blunt head trauma.
You talked about there were at least 17 impact wounds.
Yes.
Would I want to talk about those wounds individually for a moment. Would each of those wounds by itself have been fatal?
I would argue no.
Did you also determine a manner of death?
Yes.
And what was that?
Homicide.
And did you, I want to show you what's been marked as State's Exhibit 116. It's been shown to defense counsel previously.
Yes, ma'am.
And
Sure.
what is State's Exhibit 116?
This appears to be a certified Florida death certificate.
Is that the death certificate for Teresa Sievers?
Yes, it is.
Move to introduce 116. Evidence.
May we approach?
Sure.
Could you give me just one moment, Your Honor?
Yes, ma'am.
Your Honor, may I approach the clerk?
Yes, ma'am.
United States Exhibit 1. 1, yes, of course. Dr. Coyne, I'm showing you what's in evidence as State's Exhibit Number 1. Is this the individual on whom you performed the autopsy that we've referred to as Teresa Sievers?
Yes, it is.
And was Teresa Sievers a human being?
Yes, she was.
Tender the witness.
Defense?
Thank you, Your Honor.
Yes, sir.
Good afternoon, Dr. Coyne.
How are you?
Good, how are you?
Good, thank you.
Doctor, before beginning an examination, you obtain information from the medical examiner, investigators, and law enforcement, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, and you did not go to the crime scene on Jarvis?
I did not, no.
Okay. And that is standard procedure here?
For our office, yes. Other offices, it differs. Some districts have their doctors go to death scenes if it involves a homicide. For instance, when I trained in Miami, I went to all death scenes myself. However, here we have full-time medical legal death investigators, all of whom are board certified and go to scenes for us.
Okay, so when the ME doesn't go there,
Yeah.
You're completely reliant upon the photos that are taken by your medical
Investigators.
examiner, investigator.
Yes, that's correct.
Crime scene people. And you would agree that it's important for anyone charged with making decisions in a homicide to, if they can't actually go to the crime scene, to see photos of the crime scene?
Yeah, certainly the crime scene is definitely very helpful, especially in cases where there aren't visible injuries. But the great thing for us, and because we have a smaller office too, we rely upon our investigators to go, because crime scenes very often happen in late hours of the night, and the physicians who cut many days during the week, it allows us to at least be rested in time for autopsy. But thankfully, we have great investigators who take a lot of photos and can recreate the crime scene from that.
So you're able to use those photos to,
Sure, yes.
in your mind, determine what you believe happened, so you can draw your conclusions?
Yeah, we're able to see the positioning of the body, the general surroundings of the home. It allows us to look to see if there are any medications present that may have contributed, things of that nature.
And it would be important for you to see where the actual homicide occurred?
Depends. I mean, for me, at the end of the day, I'm trying to determine cause and manner of death. And so what led this person to pass would have been the injuries themselves, which I'm going to see during the autopsy.
Okay, thank you. The autopsy of Dr. Sievers. Now, first of all, you did not know Dr. Sievers.
I did not know.
It's a small community
Yes,
here, but
yeah,
you did not know.
did not know her. No, I did not.
When you began your autopsy, present in the room were Sarah Norman and Sean Martin from your office,
Yes, that's correct.
correct? Major Kallstrom,
Yes.
Lieutenant Levitt,
Yep.
Detective Jamie Nolan, and the crime scene
John-
techs,
John
Gladys
Lath-
Martinez and Christine Rose.
And John Lathrop also was there. Also, he came in and out of there. Yeah.
Okay, and Lathrop is also a
Yeah.
lieutenant.
I mean,
correct?
yeah.
Okay.
Now he is. Yeah. At the time, he was a detective. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. During your examination, you weren't able to determine in what order these wounds were inflicted, correct?
No, I was not.
Okay. And your examination did not indicate that there were multiple weapons used in this?
It did not. No.
The examination that you did not indicate to you that there were multiple assailants?
I did not. No.
Okay. The catastrophic wound to the back of the head
Yes.
that we've shown to the jury, that's the occipital region of the skull?
Yes.
And that wound was caused by multiple blows, I believe you said 3 minimum.
Yeah.
Could it have been more?
Quite possible.
Okay. And those blows landed close together?
Yes.
So these were controlled strikes with the hammer?
I believe so. Yeah.
Not wild swinging, they fell close together?
I couldn't tell you. The person was good with the hammer, perhaps, and but I'm not quite sure.
Okay, but logic would dictate that these were they fell close together. It would have to be controlled.
There was a grouping
strikes.
of them. That's correct. Yeah.
And there were repeated blows. Okay, I think you covered a number of those questions for me. It's your opinion then that one catastrophic blow to the occipital region, that was the cause of death?
The other blows. So to step back a second, impact to the head with a skull fracture doesn't necessarily have to injure the brain. It can certainly be concussive and not cause a person to lose conscious. And those multiple blows collectively may have caused the person to become unconscious, and had they lived longer, the secondary injury, brain swelling, what have you, certainly could have been fatal. However, that was the one wound, I believe, that caused that basilar skull fracture, and that's the only wound that I can definitely say is most certainly fatal.
Okay, now observing that that wound in the photos from the autopsy,
Sure.
was there brain tissue that was missing from that wound?
There was brain tissue that was lacerated, and when I say pulverized, in other words, it was broken up, fragmented. Brain is very fragile. And also, as I mentioned previously, there were petechial hemorrhages that extended inward throughout the white matter of the brain into the deep portions of the brain, and also posteriorly to the cerebellum and brainstem region. And the reason why that's important, when I see hemorrhages, it suggests that there are blood vessels that have broken. But those broken blood vessels are a surrogate marker for broken axons in the brain, and something we call traumatic axonal injury. And when you have traumatic axonal injury that is in those multiple areas, it goes to grade 3 or severe traumatic axonal injury. Most persons who survive that type of injury end up in a persistent vegetative state. And so that was a significant injury right there.
Significant enough to cause death?
Yes.
You testified that the bruising that you observed on Dr. Sievers, in your opinion, could have been defensive wounds?
Yes, could have been.
Is it possible that those bruises occurred prior to that attack?
It's quite possible.
So hours before the attack?
It's possible.
Okay, so we don't know if they occurred during the attack?
I don't know, no.
Now, you have the ability to collect, for instance, the wounds that we observed on the scalp.
Mm-hmm.
Could those wounds have been surgically removed by you and preserved?
It's quite possible, yes. So sometimes, as I mentioned previously, I often frown upon removing portions of the scalp and head when unnecessary, because I definitely want to preserve as much as I can for funeral preparations for the family's sake. But in those wounds, and we had done that before for bite mark analysis and Infer, when we're looking again at stab wounds, sure, you can certainly remove the skin, and you can also remove that portion of the skull.
Okay. Was that done in this case?
It was not done in this case, no.
Okay, now you said earlier that you've performed 1,300
Yes.
autopsies, and you worked here and in Miami.
Yep, here in Miami and my training in Philadelphia.
Okay. Well, you've done autopsies in a number of places.
Yes.
So you've observed many, many different things, seen many, many different causes of
Yes,
death.
I have.
Have you performed procedures on people in the past who it was determined were murdered with hammers?
Yes, yes.
And in your experience, killings of people with hammers, now we said that you get some background on killings. It's not just what you see in your examining room.
Mm-hmm.
Do those killings tend to be personal?
I don't delve into the behavioral science aspects of homicide. I'm more in the diagnostic aspects of homicide, but I certainly do know that when I have had violent crimes such as this, it's very often either in a domestic situation or one in which the person knows the victim.
Okay, so that tend to be rage killings?
Well, you would argue that from the number of wounds, yes, but I guess I again can't speak to that. I'm not a behavioral scientist.
Okay. But a hammer, in your experience, over these 1,300, and of course all of these 1,300 autopsies have not been homicides, but the homicides that you have performed.
Yes, they were homicides.
Is a hammer a typical weapon that's used?
Well, in a lot of these cases, it's been an object that's nearby. And certainly it's an object that can produce significant injury when wielded. I've had baseball bats, metal pipes. I've had logs. I've had a number of weapons that were used, and many of times those weapons were just weapons that were nearby.
So it's just an opportunity. Somebody gets angry, they see a hammer, they grab it, and they swing it.
Quite possible.
Object
Quite
as to the
possible.
relevance.
Sustained.
Sorry.
Now, you viewed the hammer that the police collected at the crime scene, correct?
I did.
Now, there was hair tangled up in the claw of that hammer.
Yeah, there was hair, and I believe some blood was on there as well.
I'm sorry.
And I believe there was blood on the hammer as well, if I'm not
Right.
mistaken.
Anything unusual about finding hair tangled in that hammer?
Well, if a hammer was used to produce these wounds, and many of the wounds were in the scalp with associated hair, then no, it wouldn't have been unusual in that context.
Okay. So you would expect that?
In that context, yes.
Okay. Now, that hammer was, I think you described earlier, it's just a general hammer.
Yes.
Okay, it's not a framing hammer.
No, not a framing hammer. It's not an electrician's hammer or even a drywall hammer.
Ball peen hammer.
Ball peen hammer, yeah.
Okay, it's none of those.
No.
Just to go back to the wound and the missing tissue, you didn't remove that tissue.
On the back of the scalp we're talking
Right.
about? No, I did not. The tissue was all there. It was just torn and, as you can see here, retracted back from around the wound.
Okay, so it was just
Just a regular tear.
pulverized,
Yes,
as you
exactly.
said, and pushed away.
Yes.
I have one moment, Judge.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Coyne. Thank you, Your Honor.
Just a little bit, Your Honor, if I might retrieve the exhibits from.
Yes, ma'am.
Dr. Coyne, from your examination of the wounds, you can't tell whether there was one hammer or two hammers or three hammers or five hammers or 17 hammers that were used, can you?
I cannot know.
And from the examinations of the wound, you can't tell whether there was one assailant, two assailants, three assailants, or 17 assailants, can you?
I cannot.
What's a ball peen hammer?
It's a hammer that's traditionally used, I haven't seen one in years, by machinists, and the peen portion of the hammer, whereas in the previous picture was a claw. It's sort of a rounded, has a rounded head. It's used for shaping metal, using with rivets and such.
So just like a claw hammer, it has two sides.
Yes, that's correct.
The side, so the claw hammer has these claws that stick out here, and then it has the impact point of the hammer,
The head
correct?
of the hammer,
A ball peen hammer has that same impact point of a hammer, but has a ball peen on this side?
Objection, Your Honor. Counsel's testified.
Overruled.
So a ball peen hammer, yeah, it has a flat head on one side, and the rear portion, the peen part, is the rounded head. Whereas the claw hammer has that similar flattened head and then a claw.
So a ball peen hammer could make, with the same type of flat surface, could make the same could make the injuries that we saw in these photos.
Yeah, yes.
Counsel was asking you about the bruising, and I think it's State's Exhibit 115J I want to show to you. You mentioned when you were testifying that the bruising that you saw, there was a circular pattern to some of the bruising. I'm just going to ask you if that pattern is on 115J
Yeah, I remember
or
the
if it
photo.
was in other bruises that you saw.
This one, certainly the pattern of the bruising is much more rounded than the other bruises.
So you saw bruisings or patterns of bruisings that would reflect a circular impact.
It's suggestive of it, yes.
And the side of the hammer that you had in the photograph had a circular flat surface.
Yes.
is it possible in looking at any of the photographs or injuries, and I just want to hand you one. I'm going to approach and hand the witness what was introduced into evidence as State's Exhibit 115B. In looking at State's Exhibit 115B, is it possible to infer a direction of a hit from a hammer?
So sometimes, yes, you can by looking at wound margins, undermining and such. But in this here, I mean, so for instance, looking at the nose wound, and to me it seems that this came from what looked like a left to right directionality, based upon the direction of the lacerations and the well-circumscribed region of fracturing of the bone, both the nasal bone and the sort of superior aspect here of the maxilla just above the infraorbital foramen. And then, of course, but of course these here, your best evidence would be where they're located on the head. A person who's getting struck or a person being shot, I always say is a body in motion. So sometimes it's hard to tell where that person is relative to the person swinging, how their position started out.
I want to show you State's 115A, which was the first picture that we displayed to the jury, and we talked about the nose injury with that particular picture. Do the injuries that you saw on the nose provide to you a sense of the direction from which the blow came?
Yes, I think the blow would have come from the right side.
And would the victim have been lying down at the time, standing up? Can you, from those photographs, make any of those type of determinations?
I can't tell you if they were lying down or standing up. I would argue that their head position wasn't fixed, or perhaps lying down or fixed against something, or even standing up fixed against something. But nevertheless, if you look at where the wound is, it's directly within her visual field.
And when you talk about fixed, what do you mean? You said a wound could be fixed or not. What are you talking about?
The head, that is, the head leaned up against a surface, and in particular, a non-yielding surface or a firm surface. And that's because, when you are struck, as you can imagine, if I'm standing still and I'm struck in the head, my head is going to move opposite the direction of the force. But if it's fixed, it can't move. And so the force is being sent directly into that firm, fixed, non-yielding surface back into the head again. So, for instance, the wound on the posterior aspect of the skull, the one that led to the hinge fracture, I would argue at that point in time the head was perhaps fixed.
And the injuries that you see on the nose and some of the injuries that we see on the forehead, are those more likely to be fixed or not fixed?
I would argue, based upon their appearance, that the head was not fixed at the time.
Thank you very much. Let me just retrieve those. Thank you very much, Dr. Coyne.
Yes, sir.
I'm moving.
Doctor, for the wound to the base of the skull, the occipital region, is it a likely scenario that the doctor would be on the floor, her head turned, struck from behind?
That's what I believe, sir.
Thank you.
Is this witness to be released or retained?
Released, Your Honor.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you
You're
very
free to go. Next witness.
Your Honor, the state has no further witnesses. Could you give the state just a moment, Your Honor?
Yes, ma'am.
First, I want to hand to the clerk. confirm with the clerk that all exhibits were admitted with one final confirmation that those that were proffered were admitted or that we have discussed and have an appreciation for. With that, the state, I may just approach the clerk for one last moment, Your Honor.
Yes, ma'am. If you need a moment, we can take a brief recess.
Just a brief recess, just to confirm, Your Honor.
I'm going to ask our jurors not to talk about the case among yourselves or with anybody else, or look up any of the people or places involved, and we'll be with you momentarily. We'll take a brief 10-minute recess or so, let everyone use the restroom if they need to, 10 to 15 minutes. If you guys can work on some language you can agree to on Proffer, we can read that to the jury as well. Okay. We'll be in recess.